Now, obviously, we should fianchetto our bishop and then play d6. Now, the main decisions... There are two main decisions that you have to make as a King's Indian / Grunfeld player. If you're a Grunfeld player, you can play d5 here. I've never been a huge fan of that move because white gets this massive clamp on the e5 square. If you're a King's Indian player, it's a complete no-brainer. You play d6, but then you have to make a second decision after you castle. And that second decision is whether you orient yourself toward e5 or c5. Both of these pawn breaks represent entirely viable systems, but you want to be consistent. If you want to prepare e5, then you want to prepare e5. If you want to play c5, then it's a very good idea to then fianchetto the light squared bishop. Now, bishop d3, as some of you may know, is an inaccuracy. Could somebody explain to me why it's an inaccuracy? And on the basis of that, could somebody tell me which of these two pawn breaks we should orient for here? So, yeah, so this puts the bishop and the knight in a forkable position. At some point, e5 comes with tempo, but that's not the main problem. I mean, that's part of the London. The problem is going to be, like, e4 is going to become possible at some point if he's not careful. And white's probably going to have to lose a tempo because allowing this fork would be disastrous. So clearly we should prepare e5. How should we prepare e5? First, we should make the flexible developing move. We should just play knight c6. Generally, in the King's Indian, the knight goes to d7, but in this specific instance, the knight is fine here. And now, believe it or not, we can play e5 immediately, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's play rook e8. And let's see if he falls into it. Now, he probably is aware, given his speed of play, that this is a threat. And he plays bishop c2. So he does play prophylactically here, but still, white's setup is very toothless. We get e5 in a very good version, and white's position is just not particularly impressive. So we take back with the pawn, obviously, and we've got ourselves a very nice position out of the opening. Okay, so this is, of course, equal. It's toothless, but white is not worse. So we should just play this slowly or play this normally. All right, so how should we continue? In such positions, I always like to ask the bishop a question. The move h6 generally has no drawbacks. Just play h6, see what he does. And of course, if white takes on f6, then that gives us the two bishops. So bishop h4. And so yeah, of course, we have the possibility now of going g5, and we should seriously evaluate it. The problem with g5 is clearly that it creates weaknesses on the king's side. So the question we have to follow up with is the pin annoying enough to warrant the move g5? And I think the answer is no. I think that we can sort of ignore the pin for the time being. It's true that he has the potential for knight e4, but other than knight e4, there's no other way to put pressure on the knight. And the knight has two defenders, so the knight is safe here. One thing that I would want to do here, first of all, we should complete our development. Our bishop is as yet undeveloped. Where should we put it? Where would be a good spot for the bishop? Not f5, because the trade would cripple black's pawn structure. Bishop g4 would be pretty much an empty pin on account of h3. We've gone over this before, and then we're just going to have to drop the bishop back. So bishop e6, I think, is the safest and most harmonious square. Queen e2. Okay, so we're going to play queen e7, copying his move and preparing rook a to d8. Knight to e4. All right, so as predicted, he tries to put pressure on the knight. And once again, we should keep an eye on the fact that g5 is always possible in these situations, but we still don't need to do anything. We do not need to panic because this knight is perfectly well protected by the queen and the bishop. So we can continue as planned, which means essentially a move like rook a to d8, bringing the rook into the game. Yeah, this is a boring position, but you got to know how to play these. I mean, if you want to be... if you want to progress past this level, you got to know how to outplay people from boring positions. That's just a prerequisite. All right, so something interesting has happened now that he's castled. Once he castles, I essentially know that he's not going to be attacking me on the king's side. Why not? Because, well, at least it's going to be much, much harder. So what move is now a little bit more palatable than it was before? Now that he's castled short, the move g5 now seems a lot less risky to me than it did before he castled. Because, yes, it weakens the diagonal, it creates the same weaknesses, but But it doesn't come associated with the same amount of risk. He's probably not going to sacrifice, presumably. Maybe he will, I don't know. He might sacrifice. He's definitely thinking about it. But assuming that he doesn't, yeah, so he plays bishop g3. Our king is perfectly safe, given that he himself is also castled kingside. All right. Now, there are several typical ideas. Some of you may be considering knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, and then f5. But if you calculate concretely, white can take the knight on c6 in that position, which is a major flaw in that idea. I do, however, like the general concept of trying to push the f-pawn. The issue with it is that if you take on e4, he takes back with the bishop, and then makes contact with the knight, which forces us to lose the tempo. So we can essentially do something where we circumvent his knight, and then prepare the move f5 with tempo. Now, almost everybody's thinking about knight h5. I don't love that move. The reason I don't love it is because that knight on h5 is going to get a little bit loose. And one of the things that he can do, and I'll explain this more after the game, because we don't have much time, is he can drop the knight from f3, for example, to d2. And that knight on h5 is going to be very vulnerable, and the trade on g3 is beneficial to white, because what's going to happen is white is going to take back with the knight, and look at that f5 square. If the knight gets to g3, white's going to control that very important outpost square, and it's going to make it harder for us to play f5. So what we want to do is we want to go knight to d5, put the knight on a very protected square so that he can't really bother it, and then we are ready to play f5. In addition, if he plays c4, then that opens up the b4 square for the knight. That's a common type of idea, right? We shouldn't worry about him attacking the knight. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so he allows f5. We can play it immediately, and I think he's just blundered a piece. I think that white has neglected the threat against the bishop on g3, as many of you indicated. We're just threatening to push the pawn all the way to f4, trapping the bishop on g3. Yeah. And that's a common blunder because, okay, so bishop takes c5, and that makes the situation worse. So, as I've advised many times, the moment you believe that your opponent blunders, you need to keep your eyes peeled, because what often happens is that one blunder follows another. You know, your opponent blunders, he gets tilted, and they try to, to remedy the situation, but in doing so, blunder further. So rather than just blindly taking on e5, if you look carefully at the position, we have the possibility of taking on e4. Now, why is this good? Because, well, if he takes back, then we will win a second piece by taking on e5. And if, after f takes c4, he takes the bishop, this is the crux of the line, we don't have to recapture on g7. We first take the knight on f3, attacking the queen. That's the important bit. He has to respond to that, and then we take on g7, and we will be 2 pieces up. That's an overwhelming advantage, and the win is going to be very simple. I wouldn't dismiss, this guy. I think that rook a d1 was the blunder, and it makes white look bad, but he played very well up to that point. Okay, so takes. Okay, we can play king takes g7 or queen takes g7. It doesn't really matter. Queen takes. Yeah, let's play queen takes, just so we protect some of these squares around our king. Okay, so here we have one little problem left to solve. The knight on d5 is under attack. If we move the knight, we potentially expose the rooks to a little bit of tension. I don't necessarily want to allow that. Who can find a counterattack against one of his pieces that then allows us to bolster this knight with c6? Yeah, we can. Very nice. We can drop the knight to e5, centralize it, and then play c6 to support this other knight so that he doesn't orchestrate any shenanigans down the d file. Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got to play a little bit faster. We've got 2.5 minutes, but the position is completely winning for black. Okay, he takes, which is a blunder. Thank you for the queen. And that is about his gambit. Yeah. Okay. I think he just got really tilted. I think that was the issue. Okay. Cool. That was a little bit anticlimactic, but it's fine. So bishop d3, as I explained, is not a move in the spirit of the London. In general, in the London system, you play, I think you start with h3. And the setup that I was going to show you guys, provided that he played the correct line, is knight f to d7. Knight f to d7. You drop this other knight back to d7. This looks like a terrible move. Guys, and part of the new commands is, you know, if I end up playing one more, great. If I don't, I don't. But let's just enjoy the analysis. There's plenty to learn from here. And I'll probably end after this, after the analysis for today. So knight f to d7. Now, what's the idea? You're blocking the bishop. That may seem like a pretty significant drawback to that move. But what you're doing is you're opening up the other bishop. And you are accelerating the pace with which e5 can be played. So bishop e2, you're already prepared to play e5. You've got 1, 2, 3 defenders and 1, 2, 3 attackers, which means e5 is possible. Well, no, you have to know it. I learned it. You have to know it. It's I think, called the Armenian variation. And the point is that after bishop h2, now you develop the other knight to c6. And after the move c3, which is very typical for London players, they generally respond like that. There is another benefit of dropping the knight away from f6. So the first one was that you could accelerate the pace of playing e5. Does anybody know what the second benefit is of dropping the knight to d7? Yeah, so now you can play f5. And that is a very desirable move in the King's Indian. And if you've watched some of my games with Min, we used to go into this line a lot when I played the King's Indian against him. Black drives this interesting little pawn wedge down white's position. And then the knight returns back to f6, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. And you get this very important type of position. This, I think this is actually the theoretical continuation. And clearly, with the center closed, black is going to attack on the king's side, and white is going to attack on the queen's side. So white pushes the pawns here, b5, c4, etc. And black pushes pawns on the king's side. For King's Indian players, I think this is a very good line, particularly because in the London, white often tries to get the situation out of, or get the position out of something super tactical. So this is definitely something you should investigate if you're looking for something relatively reputable against the London. No, white should break with f3. I think that Min has done that in the past, trying to break with f3 and reopen the center. Black can keep the center closed by playing d5. Black can also take on f3, and then this e3 pawn becomes a little bit backward and weak. So here you can pile up on that pawn with rook e8. Yeah, so f5, of course, technically weakens the diagonal, but that's not something... I've talked about this before. This is one of the most innocuous diagonals that you can weaken. Because other than a check on b3, which is totally innocuous after king h8, it's not that a check on c4 or b3 gives white any inherent advantage, right? So you always have the h8 square for the king. This is not a serious weakness of the king side. In addition, I see that some of you were worried about d5. That's nothing to worry about. The knight can drop back to e7. In the King's Indian, this move is rarely worrisome. And after something like c4, f5, you get a similar type of position to what we just discussed. Where can you learn more about this? Well, if you have chess base, you can definitely analyze with an engine, but you can sort of search these moves, maybe in Opening Explorer. Also, you can use an engine and just analyze, right? You can use the Lichess engine, for example, and just create a little file, create a little study where you consider, and Lichess also has game reference, so you can click a button and it basically shows you what the most popular moves are, and you can create for yourself a little bit of a little file using the engine, using the top games, and just study the theory. It's not entirely unintuitive. And, you know, Lichess is a very good integrated sort of study feature where you can create your own files and stuff. Okay, so bishop d3 is inaccurate. c3, rook e8. And again, after castles, he does not technically, I think it's called the Armenian variation, but I'm not sure. This is like this is the King's Indian London system. And then knight f d7, I think, is like the Armenian variation, but I don't remember. So after e5, does white actually lose a piece here? Had he not dropped the bishop back to c2, does white in reality lose a piece? No, white does not lose a piece because white has bishop to g5. That's an important detail. And if black stubbornly plays e4, then obviously after knight takes e4, due to the pin, you're unable to reclaim the knight. But black still emerges with an advantage because you can now play h6. And now white must take the knight on f6, giving black the two bishops in a very nice position, because if bishop h4, then clearly you play g5, and then e4 wins the piece. So in this position, white has to take. You take, for example, with the queen. Then black has a very clear plan. You want to drop the queen back, or if you had taken with the bishop, which is also possible, you can drop the bishop back. It's basically the same thing. And then go f5 and g5 and e4, and you've got the two bishops in a nice position. So that's part of the reason bishop d3 is a little bit of an awkward move. Okay, so he played bishop c2, which I like. That allows white to preserve the bishop, and bishop g5 is good as well. h6, bishop h4. What if knight g5 to save the bishop? Well, I mean, yeah, knight g5 would technically be the best move. I mean, at least white would get two pawns for the piece, but this is insufficient compensation. Here, white has insufficient compensation for sure. Maybe you can unpin yourself by playing queen to d7, try to get the queen to g4. I think white can play this. This is interesting, but the computer likes the move d5 here, just claiming the center, and then play queen to d6, unpinning yourself like that. Okay. Yeah, so that's the point. Yeah, d5, queen, d6. All right, so in the game, he plays bishop c2, e5, trade, bishop g5. Okay, so h6, bishop h4, and yeah, so g5 was interesting here before he castled even here. But I had second thoughts after bishop g3. I wanted to delay this move until he castled, as we had been discussing during the game. And so that's why bishop e6 was the move that I chose. Queen e2, queen e7, knight e4, rook a d8, and only after castles do we play g5. Now I think that bishop g3 is a very serious mistake, because it allows us to play knight d5, and it's very, very difficult for white to stop the mad rush of these pawns down the king's side. So what would I have done with white? I would have taken on f6 first, bishop takes f6, and only now drop the bishop to g3. Now what's the difference? What if black just drops the bishop to g7 and prepares f5 here? Does white have a way to stop f5? And this is what constitutes, I think, the key difference between this line and what he played. Here, white has an additional move. White has the crucial move e4. And I think white is okay. I would have played h5 and tried to get an attack going on the king's side. But, white plays h4, and the position's very, very double-edged. But the way that white played after bishop g3, knight e5 creates a very interesting situation, and I've talked about this before. People often assume that a piece that is in the center, particularly a knight, is going to be good. That is not true. Just because a piece is in the center of the board does not mean that it's well placed. The knight is very poorly placed here, because it's very susceptible to this move f5. And in order to salvage the game, white should have gotten the knight back to d2. Does knight takes e4? Oh yeah, so I was going to show you why this doesn't win a piece. So many of you proposed this, but if you look at this position very carefully, you'll notice that white can now take the knight, and to add insult to injury, now the pawn on e5 is hanging, and f4 is no longer possible. So here you have to be very concrete. Why not? Well, bishop c4 doesn't work because that square is protected by white's queen. After knight e4, bishop e4, could we go knight a5, threatening this and this? That's a great idea, but white can parry both threats at the same time. Who can find the way how? White can stop or thwart both threats at the same time, stopping f5 while it's also taking the sting out of bishop c4. Queen to c2 is correct. No, not bishop d3. Bishop d3 doesn't really stop f5 because now black threatens both e4 and f4. Queen c2 is a very classy move. creating a battery and a clamp on this f5 square. Bishop c4 is no longer dangerous because the rook can just move away. So these kinds of moves, you know, they start occurring frequently at this level, and you've got to spot them if you want to calculate well. So knight takes g5 is not a blunder. No, I think knight g5 is interesting. And I think after hg, bishop g5, it is totally not trivial that white doesn't have enough compensation. In fact, I think it's crucial for black to find the move bishop d5. Otherwise, white threatens to play queen to f3, and then the pressure on the f6 knight is going to become absolutely deadly. In fact, the knight is going to become indefensible. So bishop d5 is required. Now, who can tell me what white's best move is? White has to preferably do something with this knight, right? Black wants to trade the knight. The question for you guys is, should white take the knight or should white do something else? There's a very strong, and it's actually a positional move. There's a very strong positional move here. It's not f3 because then I still take the knight. It is a knight move. That's the hint I'll give. It's a knight move. Where should this knight go? Where should the knight aim? Yeah, knight g3 and the knight f5. And that's a classy maneuver. The knight can also route to h5 if necessary. And so I think perhaps practically speaking, maybe the computer says black is better, but I think this would have been a very, very good choice for white. But London players don't always like these kinds of ideas, and so I kind of banked on that when I played g5. For what it's worth, the machine says that the position is a tiny bit better for black after queen e6, but nothing major. No, it's saying it's about equal. So remember that even if after you've sacrificed a piece, you can absolutely search for positional ideas. Not everything you do has to be something insane and some sort of crazy tactical idea. You can absolutely, you know, maneuver your pieces around even after you've sacrificed something. And at this level particularly, that becomes important because you can't only have one mode when you attack. And the mode being like, let's bring the pieces in and crash through. Sometimes you have to attack with a high degree of finesse, particularly when you don't have too many pieces in the attack. You got to make the most of them. So bishop g3 is the crucial mistake. And of course, rook a1 results in the blunder of a piece. To make matters worse, this loses a second piece, but even if he would have dropped the knight back, after f4, the game is over because bishop on g3 is trapped. He takes f4. Now, don't play g takes f4 because that opens up the h4 square. But after e takes f4, the bishop is trapped. Okay, and once bishop e5 happened, okay, he blundered all of his pieces, but basically the game is already over. All right, guys. I think that's a good spot to call it a day. It's pretty late. I've had a long day. Thank you, guys. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye for now. Thank you all. Thank you for hanging out, and thank you for all of the support. I'll see you guys later. Have a great night, morning, wherever you are. Take care. Bye.